was the summer of 2014, and for my son's bar mitzvah present, just like many Jewish parents, we wanted him to bond with the Holy Land. Oh, it worked perhaps too well. My husband had stayed back at the hotel, and our friends, my son and I, had just stopped in a pharmacy.
Run to the bomb shelter, sweetie. Please hurry. I didn't hear the sirens at first, but the Israelis did. They're used to hearing these things. We ran to the back of the storeroom. It was a 12-foot by 24-foot windowless bomb shelter. My heart's pounding. Boom! Boom! I hear it and feel the percussion of the exploding bombs. I'm trying not to get sick. I look at my 13-year-old son and I think I'll never forgive myself if something happens to him.
That's an excerpt from a speech I gave to the Orange County Jewish Bar Association. It was the first, but not the last time we had to run to a bomb shelter. Our adventure and my transformation is also the subject of my book, Blasted from Complacency, A Journey from Terror to Transformation in Israel. There is no chapter in a parenting book on what to do when a war starts and you're on a family vacation. Think touring extraordinary and sacred sites mixed with cowering in bomb shelters. I'm still trying to get over the Jewish guilt of taking my son to war for his bar mitzvah present. The impact of being human targets helped me understand the plight of Israelis living like this, and it also made me want to work on peace. How Israel is often described on the news is not what I'd seen with my own eyes. And I felt Palestinian parents also preferred their children playing safely in their backyards. The missiles exploded just near enough to blow apart my world as I knew it, forever changing me. And you'd never recognize my life today with what it was like then. I believe I found my life's purpose. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Peace with Penny. Time is just flying. We've talked to Israelis, Palestinians, and others, all of them working at the grassroots level on peace between Israelis and Palestinians. For me, it's been a true honor to hear their stories and to know that there are people working so hard to make their lives on the ground better. There's joy and hope intermingled with lots of hard work. Please remember, if you've missed any of the episodes, they are on my website at pennyst.com under podcasts. Today's interview is with Myron Joshua. Myron has lived on Kibbutz Kfar Etzion for 50 years. Does Kfar Etzion sound familiar to you? Myron's life has been a veritable history lesson of Israel, from his family evading Nazi Germany before World War II, living today in Kibbutz Kfar Etzion, the site of the infamous 1948 Jewish massacre the day before the declaration of the State of Israel, to him being in the thick of the 1967 Six-Day War that produced the heated term occupied territory. Although I didn't know Myron until recently, his life's history has even intertwined with mine. During our family's harrowing trip to Israel that changed my life, resulting in me wanting to work on peace. Myron is a settler. As he became more aware of the limitations placed on his Palestinian neighbors in Gush Etzion, he got involved in broadening and deepening the connection between the Palestinians and Israeli residents of the West Bank. In his works with Roots-Shorashim-Judur, an organization striving to improve relationships between Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank, Myron acts as a Roots liaison to the civil administration, which is Israel's governing body in the West Bank. Myron certainly took my blinders off, as he will offer all of us, telling true stories of this complicated situation and sharing pictures of some of the Palestinian realities, like asking for permission from the military for appointments, licenses, and permits. What was this kind-hearted, fair Israeli settler to do? In line with his values, that meant working tirelessly to help. Without further delay, Myron, thanks for joining us. It's really great to speak with you.
Pleasure to be with you, Penny.
As I said in your introduction, your life has been a veritable history lesson of Jewish life and of Israel, from your family during the 30s until today. Can you give some details of your family leaving Germany, where they went, and your path to living in Israel, please?
Well, actually, we weren't really raised on the story as a history lesson. We just sort of lived our life as a dedicated and committed Jewish family in the States. Like you said, both my parents were refugees from Germany. They both left before the war itself, and they met in America. They left independently of each other. They got married, and I went to a public school in Minneapolis. And we went to the Talmud Torah community Hebrew school that was interdenominational. That means it was Orthodox, Reform, conservative, and maybe unaligned if there were such things then. And just part of a community that was accepting of one another. It was quite a united community. My mother was an activist in Hadassah. She was a regional president of Hadassah Women. So it was always in the background. It was just part of growing up. My mother, particularly, and my father as well, went to Israel a number of times. For example, when they were just starting to lay the foundation for the Hadassah Hospital, I remember her trips and the pictures that she brought back then. And when I was 10 years old, I was born in 1948. And when I was 10 years old, I was one of the 10 children who were called upon to carry the Israeli flag at the big auditorium at the University of Minnesota in honor of Israel's 10th birthday. So you can just say it was part of growing up, and I didn't see it particularly as a historical thing, as part of some kind of a grand narrative that I have to really be part of. I didn't think that necessarily I was going to be living in Israel. It wasn't assumed. But when I was 13, we went to the States. We came to Israel from America for a summer visit after my bar mitzvah. And then I already made an issue of, buying Israeli sandals and Israeli shorts and walking around Tel Aviv like a real Israeli. But pretty embarrassed I didn't know any Hebrew, because I looked to Israeli people, asked me directions, and I had no idea what they were talking about.
Yeah. Well, and can you talk also about how you ended up at Kibbutz Kfar Etzion?
Yeah, well, so as I said, it wasn't clear to me that I was going to be coming to live in Israel, although my father made a great effort to create in Minneapolis a chapter of Bnei Akiva. That's a national religious Zionist movement, international Zionist religious movement. And they created a branch in Minneapolis, and my older brother was like the first head of Bnei Akiva there. And it was clear, that my father was dedicated to that. My brother came to Israel on a GAP program. And I remember him convincing me that I'm going to do the same. And I guess I was kind of weak-minded, and I kind of flowed with him. Actually, I was looking for taking a year off after high school. In 1966, it was. That wasn't a normal thing to do, to take off a year from high school before going to the university. And I went to live and work and study on Kibbutz Yavne as part of Bnei Akiva's Hakshara, or year study program. And that was really the beginning of it. I said it was in 1966, and it was a year program, so you can do the math.
Yes, and here comes the 6-Day War. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience?
Exactly. So, I really enjoyed being on the kibbutz and being part of working in agriculture. They were raising cotton, along with other young religious men and women who were doing the year off. So in June of 1967, there was the war. And my father, the great Zionist, was the only parent who tried to convince his son to return home to the States. I was getting telephone calls from my cousins in Tel Aviv. I have relatives who came to Palestine before it was Israel. And they tried to convince me to leave the country and at least go to Greece for a few days until the war blows over. But of course, I didn't do that. And we dug trenches, definitely feeling the existential threat. I remember going up on the silo of the kibbutz, that's the tallest structure on the kibbutz, to look towards Jerusalem and towards the hills south of Jerusalem, where Gush Etzion is, to see what was happening in that area. And I mentioned Jerusalem and Gush Etzion together because on the day of second day of the war, when Jerusalem was taken, liberated, whatever word you want to use for what happened on that day, which was definitely a huge, huge thing. You know, the kibbutz was ecstatic. It was finally a way of releasing all of the tensions that were building up before. I mean, we had known already that the war was going to end quickly and that the threat had passed, but the liberation of Jerusalem was a huge, huge thing. And a couple of hours later, excuse me?
Sorry, I was just going to say, can you explain that actually on the kibbutz, there were people who were living there?
So what happened a couple of hours later, after we heard the news about Jerusalem, we heard that Gush Etzion, the Etzion block, was taken, was captured, or we could say liberated as well, because the area that I live in now, the Etzion, Gush Etzion, the Etzion block, which is a settlement area over the Green Line in the West Bank, which is called the occupied West Bank or called Judea and Samaria, was actually settled in 1948, before 1948, a number of times. And on my kibbutz, Kibbutz Yavne, we had a number of widows and orphans of people who fell in the battles of 1947 and 48 in Gush Etzion. There were a number of attacks in the area, convoys that were attacked, to the extent that all of the women and all of the children were evacuated from the kibbutz and went to Jerusalem, to live in Jerusalem, leaving their husbands, their fathers on the kibbutz to protect the area, along with Haganah members, fighters who came into Gush Etzion. There were 4 kibbutzim there at the time. 3 belonged to the religious kibbutz movement, and 1 belonged to the secular left wing Hashomer Tzair movement. There were 4 kibbutzim here. Some of them were Israeli born, some were Zionists who came before the war, some were Holocaust survivors. It was like a really microcosm of the Jewish people that was living here before 48. And then on the eve of Israeli Independence Day in May of 1948, the last battles took place, and there was a terrible massacre here of over 100 people who were killed. So we've gone back now, you know, from 1967 to 1948. So imagine what happened in June of 1967 when the people of Kibbutz Yavne, who had this community of widows and orphans who heard about the liberation of their old home, again, a moment of much emotion. So that was really, really an eventful day. That evening, we'll talk about, we'll get back to me, and my reaction to this was, I kind of looked up to God and I said, well, first of all, we were told that there was going to be a huge a get together at the synagogue, at the Bet Knesset of Kibbutz Yavne, where we were going to have prayers of thanksgiving for the salvation and also for the liberation of Jerusalem, I guess. But there was like a salvation really from death to life. And then there was a festive meal after that, but I didn't go because I kind of looked up to God and I said, why in the heck are you getting involved in our history? I felt something, you know, bigger than life was happening. And I think, and it shook me in a way that it wasn't, wow, this is exciting and great, but I really felt that we were on an edge of an unknown that was troublesome for me then. After that was already in June. I think maybe I will show you a picture now of what Gush Etzion is, because this has really become the focus of everything after that. We see now the picture of 1948, Gush Etzion. We'll zoom in over here to see, this is the kibbutz before 1948. This is Gush Etzion. You see the hills in Zionist terms, traditional Zionist terms. We see the barren hills of the south of Jerusalem. There were Palestinian villagers here, and actually there was decent relationships between Palestinians who were living in Gush Etzion area. There was a very small community. South of Gush Etzion, there was a Palestinian village called Beit Umar. And there was actually a history of the people of Beit Umar saving the Jews here. There were Jews who came to live here in the 1920s to Gush Etzion, to the Etzion block. And the people of Beit Umar actually saved them during the riots of 1929, when there was a terrible massacre in Hebron, and Jews were also killed in other places in the country. And the people of Beit Umar hid the Jews who were living in Gush Etzion at that time in 1929 in their village. So here we see actually another picture which is very symbolic of the second part of what it means to return to the land of Israel. There was the settlement of the land, the building of a community, but it also meant having to guard and create a system of security because of all of the dangers. And here we see the kibbutz members of Kfar Etzion before 1948 as they're standing on guard. And you can see them actually, it's hard to make up, but here you see them with a prayer shawl, with a talit, some of them, and you see the tefillin and the rifle here. So we see that it's really the combination of, on the one hand, belief in God and in their goal, but then also taking responsibility and knowing that they have to be active on the ground. This tree, which I'm showing now, is an oak tree, over 600-year-old oak tree that is a symbol of Gush Etzion. And it's a symbol of Gush Etzion because it sits in the middle of Gush Etzion, in the middle of the Etzion block. And after the fall of Gush Etzion in 1948, the widows and the children, every year on Israel Memorial Day, which is exactly the same day that the kibbutzim of Gush Etzion fell and the massacre took place, every year they would go to Mount Herzl, to the military cemetery, and look southwards towards the tree. They would always try to find a place. They couldn't see it from the cemetery itself, but they would go to the Judean hills, look southward where they could see the lone oak tree. It's called the lone oak tree, because they knew when they saw the tree that they were seeing the places closest to where their father and husbands lived, where they lived also before the war. So after the war of June 67, before I went back to the States, just a couple of weeks later, I made a point of it to take a tour of the West Bank with an Egged bus tour. We went to Jerusalem, the old city, to see the Kotel HaMaravi. I think we had the trouble trying to convince ourselves that it's no longer a Wailing Wall, it's now called the Western Wall, because we were always brought up talking about a Wailing Wall in the States many years ago.
Yeah.
Went to Bethlehem. I remember buying sheepskins from Palestinians there who were selling them on the market and by Solomon's Pools, which is next to a Palestinian village called Artas, which happens to be the home of the Palestinians who live in Gush Etzion. We'll talk about them later. And then we moved on southwards towards Gush Etzion and to the tree itself. And in 1967, I was standing by this tree. And a couple of months later, we were told by the movement, by the Bnei Akiva movement, that we are destined to help reestablish a kibbutz in Kfar Etzion, which was established in the end of the summer of 1967.
Wow. When you were talking about people asking you to come back home and all that, I could really relate to that because, that it was interesting on our pre-interview how when we were talking, I didn't know about Roots or anything else back in July 2014, but Roots members actually were involved in my life even at that time. 3 weeks before we left for our trip to Israel, Palestinians had kidnapped 3 Israeli teenagers, and 2 days before we left, they found them dead. And before we left, I was asking everybody, should we go on our trip still? Should we stay? So I could really relate to that. Can you please tell us the story of Ali Abu Awad and he was one of the co-founders of Roots, and other people who at the time.
I'll tell you how
they visited the Frankel family and had a joint breakfast and everything during the July 2014 when Palestinian missiles were raining down on Israel. So if you could talk a little bit about how my life intersected there.
Okay, so maybe I'll also share, go backwards just for a second, because if you mentioned the three boys.
Yeah.
First, here's a picture before we get to that, maybe kind of to show where the situation is, where we're located physically, and that'll also fit in with the story. So here we see in the, this wall, which is not all a wall, it's some of it's fence, but a lot of this is wall. This is outlining the Gush Etzion area, and this is actually from a United Nations kind of a site. So the visual, like, is stressing the wall a little bit more. We won't get into that; it's kind of irrelevant for what we're talking about at this point. Here we see Jerusalem and Bethlehem right south of it, and this is the Gush Etzion area here. That all of these blue and brown areas are areas of Jewish communities, Israeli communities here in the West Bank. And the blue labels are pointing out to places that are Palestinian, villages, etc. So my home actually is right here, where the cursor is. And this is the place where the three boys, the three young men, were kidnapped before they were murdered. They were actually kidnapped and murdered. About 500 meters from my house.
Oy.
These are the three boys, the three young men. Two of them were studying on my kibbutz. We have a high school here. And they went out to the, what we call a trampiata, to the place to hitchhike, to go home. To go to their homes. When they were kidnapped, and murdered during that period, it was a very, very difficult time. There was also a war going on in Gaza at the time. And what happened then was that you know, the Jewish people and everyone was were very, very involved in issues of security and issues of Hamas was the people who had kidnapped and murdered the three boys.
Right.
We arranged a prayer service, a breaking of the fast. It was during the Ramadan time. It was summer. It was a month of Ramadan, and also the day of the fast of the 17th of Tammuz, Shiva Sarba Tammuz. And this fast, this breaking of the fast, was something that was decided upon after a very special visit that took place at the home of the Frankel family. What happened was, during that period, most of the peace organizations were like, you know, they weren't functional. Israelis who were in touch with Palestinians were blaming them for the war. Palestinians were blaming the Israelis, and always talking to anybody. But in our area, the people who were involved in Roots, which was only established about a half a year previously, were continuing to be in touch. And here it's like, this was the paradox of it all. Settlers, we'll have to talk about how that happened. And Palestinians who spent time in jail for violence during the first Intifada. Ali Abu Awad, who you mentioned, was in jail for 4 years. His mother was imprisoned for 6 years. His older brother was in jail for a couple of years. So we're talking about, you know, the people that are supposed to be enemies during this very, very difficult time continued functioning, even though we were only together for a half a year. And we would meet at a field, a place where the Abu Awad family dedicated their private land for peace and transformation, for the dignity of the Palestinian people, and for reconciliation with the Jewish people here as well. And that's an amazing story that they should be telling, and not me. Mm-hmm. And we heard that the Frankel family was open to having visitors of Palestinians to come and visit them during the Shiva, during the time of condolences, the traditional 7-day condolence period of the Jewish people. And we went down in a car, in a van actually, because we were like about 8 people. Israelis, settlers, and Palestinians went to visit the family of the Frankel family. We got to the house there, and they had a big tent out on the lawn. And the tent was full of young Israelis, all religious. 90% of them were religious, young people. And it was so full, you know, people wanted to give their condolences, but everyone could only stand and go sort of in a line, stand in line and give their 5 seconds of the traditional condolence, and here a hug and there a handshake. And we walked in, Israelis and Palestinians together. And then the family started moving everybody aside and brought out chairs for the Palestinians to sit opposite the Frankel family. So this was with Ali Abu Awad and then a couple of other Palestinians that we brought along with us. And it was just amazing to see the reaction of the Israelis that were there. People were taking out their cell phones to take pictures. They were calling their friends to tell them that this is an unbelievable thing. They couldn't understand what was happening. As these Palestinians were talking in Arabic, Ali was hearing the Arabic and translating into Hebrew. And on the way out, I remember when the grandfather came out to speak to Ali. The grandfather wasn't out there the whole time because he's older. He came out to shake Ali's hand and to speak to Ali, and he says, "So do you really believe in the future that we will have peace?" And Ali says, "I don't know about belief, but I have hope." And that's the only thing that we have to do is harness that hope. And to see their handshake, that was, for me, just remembering it shows how much was so deeply engraved. So on the way home from that visit, there was a telephone call that was made to one of the Israelis in the van, and there was a newspaper reporter. And he heard there were Palestinians who went to the Frankel family. So Ali said he's willing to talk to the reporter, but don't say my name, don't tell them anything about me. I'll tell them I'm a Palestinian from the Hebron area, not even what village he's from, which is Beit Umar. And then within a couple of days, Ali and this other Israeli, Elias Cohen, were on Israeli television. Ali showing his face, giving his name, announcing we are going to have a breaking of the fast together with prayers of the Jewish people will be praying their prayer and the Muslim will pray their prayer, and we will break our fast together. And then Ali made sure to say, but I'm secular, so I don't do fasting. I do a hunger strike. This will be a breaking of my hunger strike. So I think that is in a nutshell, you know, the kind of brave and courageous acts of people as individuals going beyond the ideologies and the politics. And even though, you know, for Ali and for all of us, which we respect 100%, this is part of him being a dignified Palestinian. It's not, it's part of his humanity. And for him, that's what dignity is, being, raising the flag of dignity for Palestinians means raising the flag of humanity.
So in Gush Etzion, can you give an idea of the number of people and the number of settlements and even what the difference between a kibbutz and a settlement, you know?
Yeah, okay. There are, in Gush Etzion area, there are a number of smaller villages, about a dozen and a half to about a dozen and a half villages, depending on how you count them, it's not so important, that range between 200 and 1,000 or 2,000 people. Okay, so some of them are just small communities that grow. Some of them are kibbutzim, which means that they're communal. There are a couple of larger places that are cities, like the city of Efrat, which is about 15,000 people, and the city of Beitar Illit, which is ultra-Orthodox, which has grown now to be almost 70,000 people. And each one is really unique in its own way. Now, the reason they're called settlements is because they're over the green line and it's disputed. So it's a big thing in English. In Hebrew, it's a hard thing in English to talk about because you don't really have a word for what's called kosher settlements inside Israel. And Israel, you know, the kibbutz that I was on, Kibbutz Yavne, was also a settlement. I don't know what else you could call it, a kibbutz, but there are different forms of settlement. For the Jewish people returning to the land of Israel, the idea of being close to the land, not only of being merchants, not only being bankers or white collar workers, but returning to the land meant going into agriculture, meant living close to the land. And this was one of the reasons why settlements, which included moshavim, which were not cooperative, and kibbutzim, which are cooperative or communal, were formed. And they were all called settlements. We don't have another word for them except for each specific type, kibbutz, moshav, or what have you, or development town, which came later. But since '67, we have this differentiation between what's undisputed or occupied areas and what's in Israel proper.
When we were talking, and you've done so much work trying to help your Palestinian neighbors, but you told me that it took you 25 years before you knew there was a problem. Can you tell us why and what you mean by that?
This is really, I think, yeah, this is really the key. I think, like a lot of people that are living in this area, we're quite blind to everything we see around us. I'm going to show you now a picture of the way we see Gush Etzion. This is at the bus stop inside Kfar Etzion, made by children of the kibbutz, grandchildren of the original settlers. Some of them are grandchildren of original settlers. And we see in the middle the tree of Gush Etzion. We see in the middle of the tree of Gush Etzion, we see pictures of the history of the fathers working and the mothers and the children themselves, their parents as children. Excuse me. We see the agriculture, the turkeys, we see the building, we see kids playing. We see the synagogue with its stained glass window, we see the homes. This is what we see. And actually, we also think and believe that, well, they're not shown here. We know that they're Arabs, Palestinians, you know, we may debate what the term to be used, are living around us. And it's amazing that it took me so long to really see how bad the situation is. And that's a story I want to tell. Because when I was here in 1967 in Israel, and told afterwards I was going to come to join the people returning to Kibbutz Kfar Etzion, I had my doubts about it. I didn't think it was a wise thing to do. I was against settling the area of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. I believe politically it's the wrong thing to do. I was left of center, you would say, thinking that we must be ready to return the area of the West Bank in some kind of a peace agreement with the Jordanians, with the Palestinians, whoever. And we should forego returning to the areas over the Green Line. I was convinced by people that Gush Etzion is not the same as every place in the West Bank. Because besides Gush Etzion, just a few months later, there were attempts to return and rebuild the city of the Jewish community of Hebron, which is also a very, very important city for the Jewish people over the centuries. And there was a community there that was wiped out in a terrible massacre in 1929. And I knew that going back to Hebron just didn't make sense. I knew that it didn't make sense. I have a grandson who just came and brought me some great coffee. Thank you. So I knew going back to Hebron just didn't make sense. There was no way that the Jewish people can develop and its Jewish state in a democratic way and bring in, remember, this was before there was Aliyah from Russia. This is when we were still dealing with integration of Mizrahi Jews, Jews from the Sephardic and from the Arab countries that were coming into Israel. There were a lot of issues there about discrimination. There were just so many social issues. I said, well, you know, there's no way that we should be expanding our borders. And actually, amongst religious Zionists, a lot of people really believe that there should be what's called territorial compromise. But I was convinced that Gush Etzion is different. It's what's called in the consensus because of its specific location. And I decided to come here anyway. So here I was with politics, left of center. When Oslo came, I was for Oslo. I believed in the Oslo agreements. I remember most of the kibbutz went out on big demonstrations against Oslo. And I was at home writing a letter to Shimon Peres, telling him that I think that what he's doing is a good thing, along with some other people on the kibbutz. So during Oslo and after the Oslo agreement, because of my left of center opinions, I was invited to come to what's called a peace cafe. This is not a Roots peace cafe. We also have our peace cafes. This is a different kind of a peace cafe. This is a normal peace cafe of the peace organizations. You know, there are always different organizations who are for peace, like Peace Now and Combatants for Peace, and different kind of organizations that are for peace. And usually religious people like myself are not really part of those organizations. But there was a group of people that said they're interested, if there are people in the left of center in the settlements, they'd like them to join an organization called the Children of Abraham. That has nothing to do with all the way of the Abrahamic Federation or Abrahamic Accords. It was an organization called Children of Abraham, who are actually people from the Labor Party, left of center, secular Jews, and they were interested in having someone like me with a kippah joining them. And I went to the peace cafes, and you see pictures of the cafe, of the peace cafe, of a number of get-togethers that we had. But the first time I went to a peace cafe, this was what was interesting for me, is I walked into this place by Bethlehem, and when I walked into the peace cafe, all of a sudden I felt like a tension in the air, and everybody took 2 steps back when I walked in. And I realized, again, it was because of the kippah. Here I was, the odd man out, obviously not part of the normal group. And then one of the Israelis asked me, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Kfar Etzion. Well, that already pegged me. That means I'm a settler. I'm not only religious, there were always religious dubs. There's a group called Oz V'Shalom, which identified with, Nemanei Torah V'Avodah, left of center, religious Zionists who were for territorial compromise, who supported Oslo. So I said, I'm from Kfar Etzion, and I'm a settler. I didn't have to say it. They knew I was a settler. So then they really took another step backwards. But at the same time, the Palestinians took a step forward, and they came to me, and they said, you're from Kfar Etzion? Wow, maybe you know Moti, the guy who was in charge of the orchards. I'd really like to work in the orchard because my brother works there. Another Palestinian came to me and said, you're from Kfar Etzion. When I was a little kid, my father used to bring me to Kfar Etzion to buy turkeys during the Ramadan, so that we would have turkeys for the holiday after Ramadan. And he just remembered the experience of coming to Kfar Etzion for the turkeys. So I really, really felt good, because we living in Gush Etzion like to feel good about the fact that we're living side by side with Palestinians. And here you can see a neighbor of mine selling his grapes on the road. He speaks a beautiful Hebrew. He's friends with people from the kibbutzim who deal with agriculture, who have common interests, people who come and shop and buy his produce. His neighbors work inside kibbutz, inside the Gush Etzion institutions, in the yeshiva, the theological college, in the elementary school, all over. So this is a good feeling that I have, that we all like to have. And this blinds us, this good feeling. I think the good feeling is a big danger. And I'll show you how I fell, what trap I fell into. You remember, we're talking about after Oslo. I've been in the country from 1971 till Oslo, till 1993 or 4 or whatever. So we're talking, over 20 years. And at this peace cafe, I met a Palestinian. I said, I'll bring you to Gush Etzion, and I will show you how we have life in Gush Etzion We live together in coexistence. So here you can see the tree that we saw before, in the middle of Gush Etzion. Next to the tree is the school, the elementary school of Kfar Etzion, of Gush Etzion. The custodian, the head custodian of this school, Musa, had been working there already for 20 years almost. He had the keys to all of the rooms in the school, a man that everybody honors and respects. He just retired this last year at the age of 70, and his son has inherited his job there. So I told a Palestinian who I met at the Peace Cafe, let me give you a ride towards your home. He lives in the area of Hebron, and I'll show you Gush Etzion. So he was willing to come along, and I really felt good about this. Here I am, showing him good coexistence in Gush Etzion. We walked into the school and we went to the office of Musa. And Musa started speaking to the Palestinian in Arabic, which I don't understand, which I should say I'm ashamed not to understand. And I think that not enough of us are ashamed that we don't understand Arabic. I've been trying to learn a few times and I'm learning again. I'm not going to give up. And this is Musa's house.
That's the norm. That is the norm. That's
part the norm, right? Exactly. This
part of the problem.
This is all the norm. It's all the norm. So here they're talking, and at some stage, Musa, his voice changed, and I asked him, what did you just say now? And he says, Myron, don't worry about it. Nothing. And I said, no, tell me. Well, this is the tree. This is the school. This is Musa's house. This in the back is the tree. So you can see Musa's house is about 100 meters from the school. This picture is taken almost from my house. I'll have a picture later on of showing you Musa's house from my window. This is the picture from my window towards the school, towards the tree, here's the school again, and here's Musa's house. Okay, here's Musa's field. This is a house that I've seen for 20 years. It looks the same as it did 20 years ago, just about, 40 years ago. And Musa told me this following story. He says, Myron, I just wanted to tell him about my house. You see, my house houses my wife and my children. I have 4 boys and 4 girls. They're getting bigger. And we all live in this little house. And I have a son who's getting married. And I needed to expand my house to add a room. And at the same time, I also wanted to change the roof of my house from a tin roof to an insulated roof. So it will be more efficient in the winter. So I won't hear the noise of the rain so bad. And I turned to the authorities and I got refused. And I didn't understand. I thought Musa's living in this little house on the prairie, that this is the way a Palestinian farmer lives. And it turns out that he's actually had to ask for permission, which makes sense. You have to do planning or whatever. And he was willing to do the planning and get everything done according to whatever regulations have to be done, to have his roof changed and to fix his house up. And he was rejected. Then he said, but I got a letter of recommendation from the head of the Gush Etzion Regional Council, from the settler head of the regional council who knows me since I work in the school. And he gave me his recommendation for the army that I should be able to build my house. Not to build a house, excuse me, to fix up this quasi house of his. There are other families living there. The structures that you see over here is a brother of his, and he has another brother who lives across the road. And they all live in these small homes with tin roofs. There's one building there, a stone structure, because it's an agricultural area and it was allowed during Jordanian times to build stone structures. Everything is very, very complicated when it comes to issues of building. He told me the regional council had given him a letter of recommendation, and he pulled out the letter from his pocket and he showed it to me, and I read it in Hebrew, telling all of the praise of Musa. And he asked, the regional council had said, please help Musa be able to upgrade his house so his family can live in dignity. And then I looked at the date when all this took place. It all took place in 1988, which means it took place 6 years before I met him at the school. And he had the letter in the pocket. That's how important this letter was for him, that he got from the settler regional council head. Well, I went to that man, the regional council, and I asked, because he was a neighbor of mine, and I said, tell me, what did you do besides writing that letter? You wrote such a beautiful letter for Musa. You know politicians, you know people in the army. Couldn't you convince anybody? And he said, Myron, I didn't try to convince anybody. Why do you think I wrote him such a beautiful letter? I knew they weren't going to give it to him. For me, this like shook me. Here I was 20 years living in Gush Etzion with the right political vision. There has to be compromise. There has to be territories for peace. I was friendly enough with Musa to bring him a guest. I knew Musa. He never complained to me about his house. The kids of the school, the kids from Kfar Etzion would walk home from the school down this road right by Musa's house. And Musa's wife would come out and bring them juice and bring them pita bread to eat. And everyone was living here in beautiful coexistence. But I didn't even know that Musa couldn't build his own house and that he had no rights. And that's when I realized that it's not enough to be with the right political views. But if you don't know what's happening, you talk about grassroots, right? The roots are hidden from us. The real problem sometimes, even though they're not under the ground, they're right in front of our eyes. We don't really see it. We're blind to it. That's the norm. Like you said about not knowing Arabic. We don't know Arabic because we don't try to know Arabic. And we don't see Musa because it's so easy to close our eyes. And I was amongst the people closing my eyes.
Why don't you think, for instance, that that it's mandatory to learn both Hebrew and Arabic in the schools? If
it should be. Actually, Israeli law talks about everybody learning Arabic. It's not usually conversational Arabic. We have Arabic. The Israeli law says that signs, street signs, etc., must be in English, Arabic, and Hebrew. Arabic has a special status, even though people are trying to maybe weaken that. But it's a matter of not really seeing the other. When we're learning Arabic and when we're doing these things, it's sort of like we want things to be arranged okay. We want things to work out all right. But it takes more than that. It takes more than just wanting things. The political solution of dividing the land between two people, that's also a way of kind of, let's separate things out in order that things should work well. And that's actually laughing in the face of reality. Reality tells us it's not enough to think right thoughts. It's not enough to think of some kind of plan that's going to arrange things for us. If not willing, like Ali Abu Awad, who went out of his way to say, I'm going to go to the Frankel family. So we too must go out of the way. We must get out of our own skins. We must, try to really meet the other. And here we're already meeting at the tree. This tree, which was a symbol of the return to the Gush Etzion, was a place where we tried to bring people where I would try to bring people together to go a little bit beyond. And maybe I'll tell the story about the people in this picture, as this is an important step towards. This just shows the building and my window from Musa's house. So if you stand by Musa's house, you can see this is what he sees. When he sees a settlement, when he sees Kfar Etzion, these are the buildings he sees, and in this red square is the home of my living room. Out of this window, I see his house. So now we come to the tree. At another Peace Cafe, I met this man here, Muhammad Abu Ayash from Beit Umar, and he told me that he wanted to see Gush Etzion. Another Palestinian wanted to see Gush Etzion. And I said, so you can come to Gush Etzion. At that time, Gush Etzion was very, very quiet. There were very few problems here. The army did not have a presence on the main road. And he could come in and see Gush Etzion as much as he wanted, but no, he wanted me to go with him. So I went with him, and when we came to the tree, started taking pictures all around the tree. of the memorial stones that were put up in memory of the Jewish villages that were here before 1948. And then he asked me to take a picture of him next to the tree. And I said, what's the story? Why did you want me to take a picture of you next to the tree? So he said, well, you know, all of the stones which show are in memory of the 4 kibbutzim that fell here in 1948. For me, this tree is the memorial for my grandfather who was killed here in 1948. His grandfather was a medic in the Jordanian army and was killed at the tree. And then he told me, this was in September. He told me in a few months from now, it's going to be in May, and I want to have a memorial meeting at the tree. And I would like you to bring Israelis with you. Well, Muhammad asked, so I said, okay, I'm going to do it. And I turned to friends of mine, and here you see these 2 people are Israelis who came. The man with the sunglasses, his name is Yitzchak. His father was killed in 1948 on the same day as Muhammad's grandfather. So here we see the descendants of 2 people, one Israeli, one Palestinian, Jordanian, who were killed at the tree in May of 1948, who could come together and meet and talk about our lives here and about the future. And this is what I mean about going beyond. Even though Yitzchak doesn't know Arabic, he was willing to come and have that kind of meeting. And this is what Roots is really all about. You know, if it's Ali going to meet the Frankels, and if it's
Right.
and if it's Yitzchak who goes to meet Muhammad.
Right. You've done a lot of work with the civil administration. Can you explain what what they are and different things that you've been able to help your Palestinian neighbors with?
I wish I could say that that I have a lot of success in things, or that we have success in things, because that's not the case. You know, the issue here is really an issue of control. We use the word security an awful lot. And there's an issue of security too, because they're threats. And the minute there's threats, and the minute there's security, and the minute there's control, and the minute that we're talking about bureaucracies that are running things, and the minute we're talking about ideologies as well that are all here to preserve our identities and ourselves, we're talking about systems which ignore the individuals. And that's really the situation here. And that's why, you know, at Roots, we try to function on a lot of different levels. And there are different people who are working on different things. For me, I'm not as big an organization man, even though I'm very active in Roots, and it's kind of more important to me what's going on the ground. For example, you talk about the building, right? The building permits. You know, there's nothing that I can do about that. The people of Kibbutz Zakariva village, right in the middle of Gush Etzion, you know, Musa's house is illegal. It's legal. His house is legal because he's not touching it. He's not changing it. If he would change his roof and add a room to it, it could be destroyed. And there's no way that I could stop it. You know, any contact that I have with the civil administration isn't going to help. The way that we can help is because, you know, we know Hebrew, and we can know a little bit more about what the details are. And sometimes that's helpful, and it really depends. It changes all the time depending on who are the officers that are in charge. So,
Well, I know you've
really
spent a lot of time trying, for sure.
Yeah.
The response teams at Roots for
again, all of the Roots was started as a really grassroots place where we meet together, where we hear the stories, where we learn to go beyond and stretch our narratives, where we hear the other person's narrative and understand, as challenging as it is, by embracing or not embracing it, at least by recognizing it, we help our narrative get unstuck. We help our narrative grow. so those first years, these meetings were very, very crucial, and they continue to be crucial, especially for the young people who we have a youth group that comes and meets kids that are in their late teens. So every year, every 2 years, it's a new group, and they're all going through this. For the people who have been around for a few years, there's a need to do other things and get more active on the ground. As we become aware of, especially in the last year, there's been the need to address different issues of violence, of settler violence against Palestinian farmers. We don't always know about them, about the cases that are happening. There's very little we can do except stand alongside them when we hear about it, to go and visit afterwards, or to go during olive picking time and to join sometimes. But very often these activities are marked by our community as being kind of left wing. There's an issue about the organizations that identify with Palestinian troubles and as being left wing or whatever. So it's a huge challenge, and we're trying now to arrange with more and more settlers, mityashvim, I don't know how you say that in English without using the word settler, in different areas, to become more attentive and to react to violence that takes place.
Are your opinions controversial among your neighbors, and does it put you in danger?
No, not at all. I would say controversial, maybe, but again, remember that I was always pegged as being left of center. And now my activity is actually not limited to leftists. Many of the people in Roots are not leftist at all. And this is one of the things that was so important for me to discover, was that once we talk about the human element and the human rights and the justice that has to be done on the ground, we're not only talking about right wingers. So I'm considered more naive than what was the word you used? Than controversial, right?
Yeah.
So let's take a look here at Kibbutz Zakaria, and I'll show you that when I'm saying that we're not all right wingers. In the middle of Gush Etzion, there's a village. In the middle of Gush Etzion, there's a village called Kibbutz Zakaria, which is actually like the mother village of where Musa is from. And it's about 50 families, 50 homes there. Most of them have demolition orders on them because they do not have permits. They were like agricultural structures that became homes. Again, most of them with tin roofs that they wanted to build a mosque in 1980. You can see it in the back here, the truncated minaret. And the minaret is never going to be completed until someone makes a building plan for this community. The army came and said, you will not add another stone, another brick to that minaret, or we will destroy it. So it's been sitting like that for 40 years. Muhammad, and I didn't know about this either until about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And that's because Muhammad, who I had met at a peace cafe years after I met Musa, took me. When I finally had someone who spoke Arabic that I knew, I could say, take me into the village of Kibbutz Zakaria. I want to see what's going on in this village. This village is only 1.5 kilometers from my house, in the middle of Gush Etzion, between two settlements. And Muhammad took me into the village, and that's when I began to learn about the problems of this village that has no building rights, that has a school with demolition order on it, that the army has promised not to destroy because the army knows they need the school, but the army can't give them a permit, even though the army wants the school there, right? Because it's illegal, there's no urban planning. That's a whole big issue. We could talk about that for 2 hours. But again, let's forget again the structures and the bureaucracies and the political issue, and let's talk about the UN issue. So after that, I went to a friend of mine, Elias Cohen, where you see the guy with the long hair on the right side.
Right.
He doesn't believe in territorial compromise. Elias was raised in a settlement north of Jerusalem. He believes in the land of Israel. The Jewish people must come and live in the land of Israel. But he was a student of a Rabbi Menachem Fruman, who also believed that besides that the redemption of the Jewish people is not only returning to the land of Israel, but is also redeeming the values of the Jewish people, which has to do with brotherhood, which has to do with justice, which has to do with love, which has to do with spirit. And they believed in, they created a movement of people that wanted to really reach out against violence. Rabbi Fruman was really big on that. He would go into Arab villages that were that saw mosques torched, and he would stand with them and raise his hands up, saying, Allahu Akbar, God is great, and we must get rid of all of the violence and all of those who do violence. So here were people who were not left-wingists. There were people who established settlements. Rabbi Fruman himself was part of the settlement movement, Gush Imonim, that established settlements all over the West Bank. I disagreed with everything that he did as a head of the settlement movement, but I could identify with his pathos, with his passion for justice, etc. And I turned to Eliaz and I said, Eliaz, what's going to be with Kibbutz Zachariah? Do you know how bad the situation is there? And the students of Rabbi Fruman created a meeting with the people of Kibbutz Zachariah. We met in their school. And after that, and it was publicized in the Israeli newspapers. And after that, there was a meeting that took place next to the mosque, including Rabbi Yaakov Meidan, who's the head of the yeshiva of Kfar Etzion. Again, right of center, very right of center. And here he is with Palestinians standing next to him. Both of them are people who work in his institution. And he says, this is their land, this is their place, this is the people who work for me in my theological college. And they came and stood with them. But I can't say he's standing with them in solidarity, because he's not fighting for them to get their rights. He's not looking to see them build. Perhaps he will. He's not against it. I don't know, but I'm not getting any luck. I'm considered totally naive. That sorry for all the shaking. Okay. We'll get back here. Here's a picture of Rabbi Fruman on the mosque yelling Allahu Akbar. He's wearing his tefillin, his phylacteries, because he sees standing with Palestinians who has a mosque torch. This is a religious act. He's not going to, he's not just there saying I'm standing with solidarity, but he's saying that as a religious Jew, this is what I must do. This is the school of Kibbutz Zachariah. And then up here, right above it, you see the tin roof. Again, a simple tin roof. It has a demolition order. If they want to change the roof, they can't do it. And in the back here, this building, this is the yeshiva where Rabbi Meidan is the head of the yeshiva. So with this kind of discrepancy, this is what's made me into an unsettled settler. And in every corner, there's a place that we can add some light. Mm-hmm. And not everybody can add light every place, but everybody can find, I think, the point where he can open himself up and maybe help open his neighbors up to understanding that closing ourselves up in bureaucracies, security issues, ideologies, worrying about ourselves and closing our eyes to the effect that our existence here has. It's the tree. The tree is a place where we sit to get shade. The tree is a place which is a home where we can, like you saw in the pictures before, where we can meet under the tree together, not every man under his fig tree, but perhaps neighbors under their fig tree. Mm-hmm. But a tree is also something that casts a shadow. And our tree is casting shadows on our neighbors. So the question really is, how do we make a tree that's casting shadows, a tree which becomes a place of refuge for both of us, where we can meet each other and grow together. In other words, the tree should be our common tree. We say every man has a place under the sun. But that's really the beginning of all of the problems, because if I'm only worrying about my place under the sun, then I'm casting a shadow. And this is what we're trying to do at Roots, is to show that, the sun is big enough for all of us.
Yeah, well, a tree uses the light to grow. And certainly at Roots, you all do amazing, wonderful things. And personally, I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Myron, for really showing us what it's like to face some of the obstacles in the West Bank. And I really appreciate your hard work. I know you kind of played it down, but you work very hard to try to do what you can to help your neighbors. In the weeks ahead, we have some very interesting guests. Next week, on March 9th, Professor Mohammed S. Dajani Daoudi will be our guest at Peace with Penny. He's a Palestinian who went from being a student activist and member of Fatah, fighting for Palestinian liberation during the 1960s, to being a peace activist. We'll talk about his change of heart towards Israelis, his work against Holocaust deniers, and his other peace activities through the years, for which he's paid dearly for in both his career and personally. And to our listeners today and those listening to the recording later, thank you, and may you live in peace, shalom, and salam.